I stood in the grand hall, the soft echo of my heels against the marble floor blending with the murmurs of wedding guests. Everyone's eyes were on me, but I felt an unshakable emptiness. My husband hadn't said a single word since we walked down the aisle. The silence between us was deafening, louder than the orchestra, heavier than the chandelier above. I adjusted the silk of my gown, the fabric slipping like water through my fingers, and tried to steady my trembling hands. My phone buzzed inside my clutch. A text, maybe from my sister or from my mother, reminding me to smile for the cameras. But no, it wasn't them. A waitress appeared from behind the dessert table, hesitating before handing me a small envelope. No words, just the tilt of her head, urging me to open it. My fingers lingered over the paper, hesitant, heart hammering. I felt a strange mix of dread and hope. Something inside told me that this letter, delivered at this impossible moment, was the key to understanding him, or perhaps finally understanding everything I had been too afraid to face. The air smelled faintly of roses and champagne, the laughter of my guests almost surreal, and yet I couldn't breathe properly. My life had always been scripted, polite, controlled, and now one envelope promised to rewrite it all. I remembered the day he first went silent, years before the wedding, when I was younger and still learning the bitter taste of disappointment. I had been 19, full of dreams, and desperately hoping to be seen for who I really was. My parents had insisted I focus on a stable career, dismissing my passion for writing as frivolous. I'd argued, voice trembling but fierce, my hands clenching the worn notebook my grandmother had given me, the one she called my secret compass. "You're being unrealistic, Hannah," my father had said, the edge of irritation cutting deeper than any insult. "A woman like you should aim for security, not fantasies." My mother hadn't said a word, but her disappointed stare burned hotter than any argument. My chest tightened, the lump in my throat growing so large I thought I might choke. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. "The world may not see your value now, but you must always see it yourself." That night, I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, the notebook open on my lap. The smell of old pages and lavender from the sachet she'd tucked inside reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. I wrote feverishly, tears smudging the ink, promising myself I would not let anyone define my worth. I would carve my own path, even if it meant walking it alone. I could still feel the sting of their dismissal, the ache of being underestimated, and the quiet courage that began to rise in me. It wasn't defiance born from anger. It was determination, quiet but unbreakable. I made a choice that night. I would survive, I would thrive, and I would do it on my terms. The world could doubt me. My family could doubt me. Even he could doubt me one day, but I would never doubt myself again. That decision, made in the solitude of my bedroom with a faded notebook and trembling hands, would become the cornerstone of the woman standing silently in her wedding gown today, holding an envelope that might finally explain all the years of silence and absence. After that night in my bedroom, I set out to build a life that no one, not my family, not anyone, could ignore or control. I started small, freelance writing gigs, articles for local magazines, even a blog that I published under a pseudonym. My grandmother's notebook traveled with me everywhere, its worn edges a reminder that the world may underestimate me, but I would never underestimate myself. The early days were grueling. I worked long nights under the dim glow of my desk lamp, my fingers stiff from typing until they bled. I questioned every word, every decision, and every pitch I sent out. There were moments I wanted to quit, when rejection letters piled up like mountains on my tiny apartment floor, and the silence from those I loved felt heavier than ever. But then came Margaret, an editor in New York with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, who saw promise in my writing when no one else did. "You have a voice, Hannah," she told me one rainy afternoon. "Don't hide it. The world will notice, eventually." Her mentorship was my turning point. Under her guidance, I honed my craft, learned the nuances of publishing, and started landing bigger clients. The first check I earned that could pay rent and groceries felt like a victory worth celebrating in silence. My confidence grew alongside my income, and soon I was able to invest in myself, courses, networking, small marketing campaigns. Each step, no matter how small, felt like planting a seed of the woman I was becoming. By the time I reached my mid-20s, I had transformed my hidden talents into tangible success. I had clients across the country, my own modest but stylish apartment filled with art I loved, and a growing reputation as a reliable, creative professional. Yet I kept it all hidden from my family. When they asked how I was doing, I smiled politely, giving vague updates. They imagined I was struggling, still unsure of my path. That misconception became my quiet advantage. I was free to grow without scrutiny or expectation. I also noticed a strange shift in myself. The more I succeeded, the less I needed validation from others. I became strategic, aware, and patient. I learned that success wasn't just about money. It was about claiming my story, my voice, and my autonomy. By the time the invitation to my wedding arrived, I was a woman who had built her empire quietly, skillfully, and fiercely, without letting anyone's doubt define her. And yet, I didn't anticipate that the envelope waiting for me at the altar would challenge everything I thought I understood about love, loyalty, and the silences that had shaped my life. The letter in my hand felt heavier than any wedding dress or veil. I hadn't opened it yet, but the texture of the paper, the careful handwriting, made my pulse race. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the hall, the flicker of candles, the faint scent of lilies mingling with champagne, yet my attention was elsewhere. It wasn't just my husband who hadn't spoken, it was the universe, testing me, waiting for me to finally confront the silence. I slipped the envelope open, letting the paper unfold slowly, deliberately. The words inside were from someone I hadn't seen in years, someone who had quietly loved and believed in me when no one else did. The handwriting trembled slightly, but the message was clear. You are stronger than you know. Don't let anyone silence your heart, not even him. And there was clarity. It wasn't just a note. It was a revelation. My husband's silence was never about indifference. It was fear. Fear of me. Fear of the woman I had become. I folded the letter slowly, feeling a rush of power and heartbreak intertwining. I looked around the hall at the faces that had once doubted me. My parents, with their forced smiles, whispering among themselves, distant relatives, their eyes wide in expectation, even my closest friends, unsure how to react. They expected a bride flushed with nervous compliance, but that bride was long gone. Standing here, I was fully myself, Hannah Miller, accomplished, self-made, untouchable by their past judgments. Everyone, I said, my voice calm but firm, carrying over the soft murmur of the crowd. Before we continue, there's something you all need to know. I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting them feel it. Their anticipation, their confusion, was like a tangible weight in the room. I began recounting my journey. The lonely nights of writing, the mentorship of Margaret, the small victories that no one noticed, the clients I earned, the independence I quietly built. I described my career, my financial freedom, my achievements, not as boasting, but as undeniable truth. Each word was deliberate, painting a picture of the woman I had become. By the time I finished, the hall was silent. My parents' jaws were tight, disbelief etched into every line of their faces. My husband stared at me, eyes wide, realizing for the first time that the woman before him was not the one he thought he knew. Shame, amazement, and a strange kind of awe mixed on his face, and I felt a surge of clarity. The power was mine now. I held up the letter, letting its simple truth resonate. This, I said, reminded me that my voice, my life, and my choices belong to me, and me alone. No one can define me. No one ever has. The revelation wasn't just about my success. It was about ownership of my story, the power to confront silence with confidence, and the right to demand respect in every space I occupied. And as I met each shocked, wide-eyed gaze in the room, I knew that the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The room was heavy with silence, but I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I was no longer negotiating my worth silently. I was claiming it aloud. I looked around at the people who had underestimated me for so long, my parents, my husband, everyone expecting compliance, and I realized that the next words I spoke would set the terms, not just for them, but for the life I had built. I will not erase the past, I began, voice steady, but I can define the future. And that future comes with conditions. Their faces tightened. I could see the sudden understanding that this was not a moment for excuses or pleading. First, I said, turning to my husband, you will learn to respect silence as much as words. You can't control me by your absence or your fear. Our marriage, if it continues, will be on equal terms, mutual respect, honesty, and trust. Anything less and it's over. His eyes widened, guilt flickering, and I let him sit with it. To my parents, I said, I love you, but I will not allow your judgment to shape me anymore. If you wish to be part of my life, it must be on the terms of support, not criticism. You will listen more than you speak, understand more than you impose, and celebrate my victories rather than diminish them. Their faces shifted, shock, shame, and the beginning of comprehension. I addressed my distant relatives and friends with gentle firmness. If you wish to continue knowing me, you must see me as I am, not as you expect me to be. Any further attempts to belittle or doubt me are your loss, not mine. I felt a surge of compassion mingled with the steel of clarity. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was protecting myself. Boundaries weren't walls of hate. They were bridges to healthier, authentic connections. I watched my husband nod slightly, my parents' expressions soften, and I knew that this confrontation, this declaration, was more than power. It was healing. Then, I brought back the notebook my grandmother had given me, holding it as though it were a talisman. This, I said, reminded me that the world cannot silence the woman who knows her own strength. And now, I set the terms for those who remain in my life. The rest will step aside. For the first time, I felt the true weight of authority in my own story, balanced with empathy. I was not cruel, but I was unyielding. I was not vengeful, but I was clear. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Power doesn't come from wealth, status, or success alone. It comes from claiming your voice and insisting the world hear it. Weeks passed after the wedding, and life settled into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. My husband began to speak more, not just words, but honest conversations. He asked questions, listened without judgment, and slowly started meeting the conditions I had set. It wasn't instantaneous, and some days were harder than others, but I felt the first real taste of partnership I had ever known. My parents, too, began to change. Their calls were less about advice and more about curiosity and genuine interest. They celebrated my achievements instead of questioning them, asked about my work with sincerity, and, quietly, began to understand the woman I had always been. I forgave, not for them, but for myself. Their growth was no longer a burden. It was a reward of my own making. Even my extended family and friends started to adjust. Some distanced themselves, unable to accept the truth of my strength. But that was fine. I had learned that not everyone deserved to walk alongside me. True connection was not built on expectation or familiarity. It was built on respect, empathy, and authenticity. I often touched the notebook my grandmother had given me, now frayed and worn, the ink smeared from years of hope and determination. It had been my compass, my shield, and my quiet guide through every challenge. I realized that it wasn't just the letter at the wedding that had changed my path. It was every choice I had made, every silent struggle, every step toward independence that brought me here. One evening, as I looked out over the city from my apartment balcony, I felt a profound sense of calm. The lights of the skyline mirrored the quiet victories I had claimed in my life. I was no longer the uncertain girl who trembled with fear at the judgment of others. I was the woman who had written her own story, who had faced silence and turned it into power, who had claimed love, respect, and success on her terms. And in that moment, I whispered to myself, a soft but unwavering affirmation of everything I had become. I am not defined by their silence, nor by their expectations. I am my own voice, and I will never be quiet again.